Noam Chomsky is our next guest. Noam is an intellectual activist, professor at MIT, a world-renowned linguist, philosopher, and political analyst who lectures around the world on international affairs. Noam is the author of a new book, Rogue States, The Rule of Force in World Affairs. And recently I told a friend of mine in New Mexico that Noam was going to be a guest on the program. She just heard him talk in New Mexico not too long ago, and she was excited, and she said, listening to Noam was like being thirsty and getting a great drink of water from a fire hose. So, Noam, welcome to Gender Talk.
Nice introduction.
Oh.
Thank you. Well, yes. Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, Noam.
Very excited.
Can we start out with what is a rogue state, and who's the leading rogue state out there?
Well, actually, the book begins with some discussion of that. Like just about every term of political discourse, the word rogue state has two meanings. One is its literal meaning. You look up in the dictionary. The other is the meaning that that is assigned to it as an instrument of propaganda to beat selected enemies over the head. That distinction is pretty standard. So it holds for terms like peace process or terrorism or,
so what you're saying,
just about anything.
So what you're saying is we selectively use rogue state to define people that we want to attack?
We use rogue. The rogue state is used here to refer to any state that the U.S. That is disobedient and the U.S. has in its.
That's a good way to say
in
it.
the sights of its rifles. But the term really has a meaning. I mean, a rogue state is a state that defies international law, international norms and conventions, that demands the right to do anything it wants, refuses, pays no attention and doesn't care, in fact, about the opinions and attitudes of others who stand in its way, and so on.
So it refuses. It refuses to submit itself to world order and to international.
The conventions of world order, either international law, the dictates of the World Court, refuses to accept its legally required responsibilities and others. And, in fact, pursues what is sometimes called, actually, in the technical literature, the new sovereigntism, meaning a demand for of sovereign rights so extreme that nothing stands in its way. That term is used to refer to the United States, and in fact, by those criteria, it would be hard to find a state that qualifies more fully.
So what you're saying is the United States asserts its rights in the world, or asserts its needs in the world above the United Nations or any other kind of international negotiation.
The only qualification I would say is, and it's my fault, is the phrase "its needs." I mean, the United States is, not an entity. Like, for example, when the United States is rejecting decisions of the World Court, it's not speaking for me or for you.
That's an important distinction to keep in mind, because one of the points that you make throughout your work is that people are not really considered, but instead the military interests, the multinational corporate interests are the real sovereign interests that are taken into account. And if it means running over people, that's okay.
Yeah, that's basically true, and it runs over us too.
Yeah.
So in other words, we're not hearing the truth about what's going on in foreign affairs. Is that sort of at the?
We hear some of it, but if you look carefully, you hear a lot of the truth. But it's often presented in ways which significantly disguise what's happening. So take the notion of rogue states. There's a lot of reporting and commentary and journal articles and so on, books about rogue states. But what they refer to is, they use the term in the propaganda sense. So take, say, Cuba and the United States. Okay, Cuba is one of the official rogue states, one of the half a dozen rogue states. It's condemned for, all sorts of things. The condemnations could be right or wrong, but it's kind of irrelevant. I mean, for 40 years, Cuba, a small country which had been colonized by the United States for about 60 years until it finally won its independence. For the 40 years since, Cuba has been under constant U.S. attack. Military attack, economic warfare, efforts at strangulation, trying to induce maximal suffering on the population, straight outright terror, lots of it. So who's the rogue state?
It's kind of like doublespeak, isn't it? Same thing like when terms are mislabeled like free trade agreements that you talk about, or labor flexibility. Yeah. They're not what they really appear to be. Instead, they're kind of the opposite.
Yeah, well, actually, free trade and labor flexibility are interesting examples. Labor flexibility is kind of a fancy way of saying that when you go to sleep at night, you don't know if you have a job tomorrow morning. And that's supposed to be a very good thing. So you read the World Bank reports, they say that labor market flexibility is the primary reform that every country must institute. Even though they point out I'm virtually quoting now, labor market flexibility, they say, has gotten a bad name as a euphemism for keeping wages down and workers out, which in fact is exactly what it is, which is why it's gotten that bad name.
And longer hours, too. Yeah. That's horrific.
And that's the essential reform. So in fact, the effects are lauded. So when, say, Alan Greenspan testifies before Congress on the wonderful economy he's presiding over, wonderful for some, he explains straight out, not hiding it, that one of the bases for the foundations for the what he calls excellent economic progress is, and these are his words, growing worker insecurity. And that makes sense.
Growing worker insecurity?
And that makes sense. If workers are insecure, they don't dare to ask for higher wages, decent working conditions, benefits, and so on.
Or refuse overtime, or extra assignments.
That's the effect of greater worker insecurity.
Okay.
And that's good for the economy in a certain sense. It increases profits, it cuts down inflation. Sure, it's fine.
That's
for people.
Yeah.
I want to touch on the issue really briefly. There's so much here that we would love to just talk about with you, but we got about 15 minutes. I want very briefly the relationship between U.S. military aid to third world countries and human rights violations.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that's been very closely studied by, in academic work by leading specialists. So, for example, there's a major study of U.S. foreign aid in Latin America, U.S. military aid, and human rights in Latin America by the leading academic specialist on this, Lars Schultz at the University of North Carolina. And he found a very close relation. As he points out, military aid tends to go to the most egregious violators of fundamental human rights. That includes, he wrote that article back in 1980.
And we're not talking about Russian military aid or Iranian or Iraq?
U.S. military aid. He wrote it in 1980. There are broader studies which find the same correlation worldwide. Since 1980, there really haven't been any studies because it's too obvious. So in the 1980s, it's completely obvious that U.S. military aid in Latin America, and in fact worldwide, went to very brutal regimes. In fact, some of the worst atrocities were carrying out. Atrocities surely comparable to anything that happened in Yugoslavia in the last decade were being carried out with U.S. guns, U.S. arms, everything from the assassination of an archbishop to killing a couple 100,000 people and leaving
these are very bloody
refugees. But if you look closely, it's really quite interesting. It's worth looking at closely. So take the leading recipients of U.S. military aid and arms transfers. Well, there are two who are in a category by themselves. Israel is way above anyone else. Right. And Egypt is second, but that's because of its relations with Israel. So they're the perennial front runners, but that's a separate category. If you look at the rest, it's quite interesting how it works. So starting through the 1980s, El Salvador was the leading recipient and had about the world's worst human rights record. Turkey, military aid to Turkey shot up in 1984, not for Cold War reasons, That was the year in which Turkey began a major counterinsurgency campaign against the Kurds. And military aid to Turkey remained very high. In fact, it was in the 90s the highest, peaking in 1997, right through the whole campaign against the Kurds. By 1999, Turkey had moved down and Colombia took first place. Well, what had happened?
Yeah.
The Turkish campaign against the Kurds, its own population, had at least temporarily succeeded in repressing any form of resistance at a horrendous cost. I mean, tens of thousands killed, 2 to 3 million refugees, 3,500 villages destroyed. That's about 7 times Kosovo under NATO bombs. But Colombia had not yet succeeded in repressing its internal insurgencies. Colombia has the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere in the 1990s, and characteristically has been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid, about half. In 1999, it went up to first place. Now that aid is going up even higher, and again, the same correlation. You know, it's a very, it's not like 100%, but it's a very close correlation.
This is all very scary stuff. So we have a government that's out of control, that is basically saying we want workers to be working for lower wages and to not to have less stability, so that they're more available to us when we want them to work for us, and we want to basically ship arms to any place where there's a popular democratic uprising or an attempt to institute reform against a tyrannical government. So we ship them all kinds of arms. Now we have an election in front of us with Bush and Gore, who look like more of the same. And I just wonder, what can we do? Is there anything we can do? Is there anything we can do in this election? Is there any hope?
Oh, sure, there's plenty of hope. I mean, you know, there are things to do in elections, too. We could go into that, but I think that's kind of secondary. Something that should give all of us hope is just to look at what's happened over the last 30 years, or 40 years, or even a longer stretch, if you like. There have been very significant improvements. So, you know, many things are way better than they were 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, take your own program. Feminist issues were barely on the agenda 30 or 40 years ago.
That's so true.
Not to mention trans issues.
Environmental issues didn't exist. There was almost no opposition to aggression. I mean, when Kennedy started bombing South Vietnam, as he did, there was virtually no protest. It went on for years without protest. Native American rights were not even an object of ridicule. You know?
That's right.
Lots of interpersonal relations have changed, much for the better, in fact. Civil rights situation has improved. There's been regression, too. But overall, there's been significant improvement. It didn't come from elections. It came from extensive popular struggle. Every one of those cases.
What do you mean by let's talk about popular struggle, what it is, and, you know, what it takes to make it happen.
Well, you know,
if we can.
Educational programs, organization, protest, demands, creating alternative institutions, just what's happened in all of those cases.
You think the demonstrations in Seattle, Washington, Boston, and so forth?
Anti-WTO?
Oh, sure. In fact, they've had a big impact already.
Really? How so?
Look, you just take a look at the rhetoric at the rhetorical level. The World Bank and the IMF have changed quite considerably. They now effectively concede that the programs they've been carrying out for some years have been harmful, and they're trying to sort of buy off the demonstrators by incorporating NGOs and, you know, the more kind of respectable-looking ones, the ones who can wear ties and so on.
Because they were exposed.
Because they've been exposed, and they're afraid of the popular reaction. Now, so far, those are not substantive changes. And, you know, they claim they're changing their policies, that they agree that the policies have harmed people, caused poverty, undermined education and health and so on, and they claim they're going to change. Well, you know, they'll change if they're compelled to, not out of the goodness of their hearts. They didn't just discover this because they looked over their back records.
Yeah.
So the protests have already had an effect, and the more they intensify and develop and become something beyond protests, calls for significant modification of the institutions, linking up with people in the third world as they've already done. Those can be very powerful forces.
Interesting. So in a sense, we have a democracy, although the elections themselves aren't really the primary instrument of the democracy, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I think that's true back through history. I mean, look, the democratic rights are nothing to sneeze at. They're important.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very important that, like, say, right now, you and I know that the stormtroopers aren't going to break into your studio in my house and take us out to a torture chamber. Things like that happen.
As long as we don't cross the FBI,
yeah. And that is, I got an FBI file. It's pretty thick. But
how do you survive?
How do you?
How come you haven't been targeted, Noam?
Well, I have. I've been on Nixon's enemies list. I was up for the only reason I didn't go to jail for a long time was because the Tet Offensive came along and the prosecutions that were underway were canceled. But I don't call that being targeted. I mean, people like us are so privileged by comparison with most of the world that to talk about our own, anything that happens to us is almost kind of, obscene.
Yeah.
There are problems, but nothing like what's faced in most of the world. And in this country, over a long period, many rights have been won, not granted, won. Even some of the things that are best established here, like, say, freedom of speech, which happens to be, in that respect, the United States is, one of maybe the best place in the world. That didn't come by, that's not in the First Amendment. I mean, the Supreme Court dealt with its first serious freedom of speech case, I think, in 1931. Those rights were won by labor struggles, women's struggles, other struggles over the years, which finally brought about a change in atmosphere and attitude so that free speech is protected. The civil rights movement, for example, led to one of the first major decisions by the Supreme Court to support fundamental freedom of speech in 1964.
Wow. That's a great perspective, and it's very empowering.
And if we look at how the resistance has really operated, in your book you give an example here in New England. You said 150 years ago there was an independent labor press run by young women from the farms and laborers who condemned the degradation and subordination of the newly emerging industrial system and talked about how it was running over people and how horrible it was to rent themselves out to survive. So there's always been resistance and critiques. And now we're concerned with the...
It almost sounds like nothing changes.
Colonization of the public mind, just like, as you say in your book, the body. And could you comment on that a little bit, how it induces a philosophy of futility in us? And
well, that's
about
those phrases like inducing a philosophy of futility and regimenting the minds of men like their bodies, an army regiments their bodies. Those are straight out of the public relations industry. In fact, they're quotes from business leaders. The people with power and privilege don't decide to give it up easily.
No.
When they face popular struggles and popular victories, they don't go home. They try to figure out other ways to sustain the privilege and power that they've attained. That was rather striking. During those quotes that you mentioned are from mostly the 1920s.
Right.
And it's an interesting time. By the 1920s, the franchise had been extended to the white population, at least, including women for the first time. And there were other popular democratic victories. And that scared business greatly, both here and in England, the other leading democracy. And strikingly, primarily in the United States, secondarily in England, huge industries developed devoted to regimenting the public mind.
Yeah.
It was recognized that it's going to be harder, and very explicitly recognized that it's going to be harder to control people by force. And therefore we have to spend much more energy and effort into controlling their opinions and attitudes. And there are a lot of ways of doing this. One of the major ones is to try, I'm quoting business leaders, to try to focus people's attention on the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. Well, we all recognize that. I mean, people now are bombarded from infancy through their rest of their lives with propaganda.
And it is propaganda.
Yeah, it tries to induce them to perceive themselves as passive consumers and nothing else.
Wage slaves, consumer slaves.
Yeah. You follow orders and you try to maximize what are called invented wants.
So
that begins in infancy.
It seems like we should be contesting the media control then by, a few large corporations, because it seems like, we know that the government now is subsidizing film production and television production if they put the government message in that, if they advocate for certain things or if they have certain ideals in there. It seems like that ought to be a place we should be fighting hard.
Yeah, and it goes the other way as well. The corporate power, which of course basically runs the media, is the media in fact,
yes.
Also has enormous influence over government. The concentration of media, which is increasing, is dangerous. But even, in fact, the media, like other parts of the economy, are falling into the hands of a small number of mega corporations. It's particularly it's worse in the case of the media than in the automobile industry. Media has a different role, but there are ways around that too. Alternative media, for example.
Yeah, certainly the internet. Yeah, the internet is democratizing the media in a sense.
The internet, radio has opportunity. In fact, there are many opportunities that aren't even exploited and should be. Like, take, say, cable television. Under the original congressional acts, municipalities have to provide public access cable TV.
Yeah.
Well, that's a golden opportunity for activists.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very rarely used.
Yeah.
There are things that can be done that aren't being done.
No, unfortunately, we have to say goodbye. We have to give up the microphone to the next program. We really appreciate you coming on Gender Talk, and we hope that we'll have the opportunity to speak with you again.
Good. It was real good to talk to you.
Well, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Yeah, without you and others like you, a lot of us would be really lost.
Can we ask one final quick question?
Sure.
Should we vote for Nader?
Where do you live?
We're right here.
Well, I think I will.
Yeah, which we know is a state that is basically going to go
right.
Gore.
Swing state, though, you go Gore.
Yeah, where there's a close election, I think there a question arises.
Exactly.
And you can give arguments both ways, but
register for third party.
Yeah, but where it's a shoe-in, I think it's pretty clear at least my view of what one should do.
Ours as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good.
Take care. Have a good fall.
Bye.
Good night.
Cool.
Oh, there's so much there.
Oh,
we've been reading that book, and it's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
Well, our credibility just went up 5 points, and his went. No, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah. I've been reading this book, Rogue States, and it is like taking a drink from a fire hose.
Christine was right.
Chock full of great stuff.
Yeah.
And you got to read some Noam Chomsky. You got
to. Necessary Illusions is another great book that I used to use in graduate seminars that I taught.
If you really, he cuts clearly through a lot of the baloney, a lot of the hype, a lot of the propaganda.
He tells it like it is.
Really simple things like, we are the #1 arms exporter in the world, and every time there's human rights violations, what do? We send them more guns and planes and tanks and missiles and helicopters.
And it's worked so well to promote peace.
Well,
every time we come down on the side of the brutal dictatorship, not on the side of the liberatory revolutionary movement.
Because populations basically are there to be subordinated and dominated.
And in fact,
slaughtered.
As we heard tonight, Alan Greenspan himself said that we're keeping, what was it? Our workforce is
let's see if I can find that quote.
More uncomfortable or more uncertain or something like that.
Oh, he had the name. It was called labor flexibility, that you wanted to keep the workforce, use the labor flexibility, which means more people are going to be afraid of being laid off. Wages are going to go down.
It means more temporary jobs, fewer
longer hours
stable
worked.
jobs.
Yeah, flexible, bend over and pick up the slack.
We're over our time.
Oh, we could go on and on.
And we're so sorry to run over. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Coming up right now is Dreams of a New Age. You know our website. It's gendertalk.com. You know where you can email us. For more information about any transgender issue, call the International Foundation for Gender Education at 781-899-2212. And that does it for our program tonight. We hope you've enjoyed our show as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you. We sure enjoyed it tonight. On behalf of Gordine McKenzie, Hal Fuller, Karen Larson, Amanda Hopwine, and myself, thanks again for listening. Remember, no matter what the occasion, Gender Talk is always appropriate. Good night, everybody.